Hello and welcome. Today, I'll be talking about Dementus. Dementus is an enigma. Even Chris Hemsworth himself couldn't tell who this guy was after he read the script for the first time.
And couldn't really figure it out. I had the script for 2 years before we started shooting, and it wasn't until about 2 weeks before we started that I felt like I understood him.
So in this video, we'll demystify this character, starting with Dementus' untold backstory because, of course, it exists.
Is there a Dementus backstory?
There is. I had to do it.
Dementus comes from a very wealthy family. Yeah, he is a rich boy. And when the world fell, it helped them escape the chaos, so they set themselves up on a remote island of the coast of Australia. And that's where he grew up. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. His father was extremely brutal and used violence to toughen him up, but instead, he created a monster. And even though Dementus later became a father himself, he hated his own father with a passion. Until one day, he had done something so unforgivable that he was banished from the island and forced back onto the mainland. He knew he would never see his family again, and with a broken mind and spirit, he wandered out into the wasteland, where his deficiencies became advantageous. Displays of violence and showmanship distracted him from his own pain and attracted a small following that eventually became loyal. He promised them a life of splendor that he knew so well, but in reality, he was playing everyone off against each other for his own benefit. It elevated him to a cult-like figure that he fully embraced. Years later, with more than 3,000 bikers in this horde called the Terrible 12, we find them rummaging the wasteland like locusts, sending this loose coalition of gangs far beyond the Great Dividing Range in search of food and water. And one of the gangs, the Rubillies, did find something, or rather someone, who would bring about Dementus' demise. So there you have it. This is Dementus' backstory in a nutshell. I mean, it's not complete because George Miller might want to use it for something else in the future, but you can already get the gist of who he is. He is a victim of child abuse that left him emotionally deformed. So he pushes himself into self-destructive behavior because he's twisted and tormented. But worst of all, he pulled Furiosa into this cycle, just trying to damage her the same way that he was ruined by his own father. Now, we're scratching the surface here, and I'll get to all the nuances later, but Dementus is the most complex Mad Max villain to date. It took him about 15 years to develop this character, so let's go back to the beginning, because at first, Dementus was not complex at all. The first versions of Dementus can be found in early script treatments from 2007. Back then, he was pretty much, a template for a villain. They didn't even describe his looks, and he didn't even care about Furiosa at all. He kept her around because there were no healthy women left, and her suffering and anger was amusing him, and she had a great reason to hate him for the way that he ended her mother. Let's just say that originally Mary Jabasa survived the 5-bike Teddy, and he had to finish the job. Then after he found the Citadel, he learned that the Immortan was looking for healthy girls, so he traded Furiosa in for some food and water without batting an eye, so they did not have this complex relationship yet. Strangely enough, instead, they really focused on how Dementus was traveling across Australia. So in one version, he was just about to look for the green place after finding Furiosa until the Immortan's messenger showed up and told him, you gotta go to the Citadel because the Immortan wants to strike a deal with you and turn you into the head of security of Gastown. Now, in a slightly newer version of the story, he actually went looking for the green place for months on end, going parallel with the Great Dividing Range and fighting and assimilating tribes, and they kept telling him about this place called the Citadel, so when he finally reached the end of the continent, he turned south and eventually he found it. But it wasn't the only thing that he found. He came across ancient systems of caves and cities buried in sand, but he did not care for the past, and he even hated listening to the history man, especially when he was talking about how the world ended. So he was kind of the opposite of what Dementus was like in the film. But all that was way before George Miller put all the story locations on the real map of Australia, with a fictional mountain range in the middle of the continent around which the action of Fury Road and Furiosa takes place. And you can kind of see that mountain range in the opening of the film. Then he made a new path for Dementus, where he went around those mountains from the south, which is actually in the film, and then he went northeast until he stumbled upon the Citadel. They also had some pretty radical ideas on how to end Dementus. At first, Furiosa would just pin him down with croquet hoops and go to work on him with a chainsaw. In a newer version, she only took his head, and she brought it to the Immortan, who was so impressed that he turned her into the head of security in the Citadel. I mean, all in all, the original version of Dementus was basic, and trust me, I'm really skipping a lot just for brevity's sake, so there was definitely a lot of room for improvement. And that whole process kicked into gear when George Miller wanted to turn Furiosa into anime. In 2010s, anime started gaining in mainstream popularity, and George Miller wanted in on the action. So after watching The Animatrix, he contacted the director of The Second Renaissance Part 1 and 2, Mahiro Maeda, and he asked him if he'd like to work on the Furiosa anime. He agreed, and in result, Dementus became more fleshed out. George Miller proposed a backstory. Now, Dementus was sometimes referred to as Dr. Dementus in the scripts all throughout, and he's never called that in the film. So George thought that Dementus, or Dr. Dementus, was supposed to be an actual doctor that somehow became a leader of a huge biker gang. They just had to figure out how that happened. So Maeda-san, he thought that Dementus used to be this empathetic and intellectual man. But then something tragic happened and it made him emotionally unavailable, like he could not relate to people anymore at all. So he became this mysterious figure, very enigmatic, and that attracted a lot of rough characters that formed a gang around him. And that gave Mahiro Maeda an idea: the teddy bear. It was the only thing that Dementus could talk to, and sometimes he would turn it into a puppet and make it talk. Dementus was also visualized for the first time in this anime, so let's have a look. Maeda-san designed him as a man in his 30s, very wiry, wearing a woman's fur coat covered in blood, sweat, and grime that turned it into thorns. And he had this giant scar around his face. Now, there are at least a couple of stories explaining it. According to Mahiro Maeda, Dementus' face was almost completely ripped away at one point, so he put it back with metal staples. Now, according to Dane Hallett, the Furiosa concept artist that worked on the film 10 years later,
when I got him, the backstory from George was actually he's got a scar around his face because he actually did his own face transplant. He was so vain that he took like a beautiful man's face and put it on his face.
So this scar was with Dementus for almost a decade until it disappeared for some unknown reason. Now, Nicola Thuris, the scriptwriter, he came up with a whole new way to finish him by turning him into a tree, and that supercharged the story with allegory and metaphors and all that good stuff. And also, George Miller wanted this anime Dementus to be voiced by Tom Hardy. They even recorded some dialogue and it sounded fantastic, but it just was not meant to be. The anime fell through. However,
at one point, actually, there was a bit of talk, I believe, in actually making that into a short film, but that didn't eventuate.
Regardless, George Miller kept developing the story and its main villain, and we got a little glimpse of that in the 2015 Mad Max game. Okay, first things first, the game is not canonical, right? But it contains official lore from George Miller. Except we don't know how accurate it is anymore because he was not involved in the game at all. But I'm pretty sure that Dementus' lore comes directly from George because it's just very specific for no reason at all. So what does it say about Dementus? Well, that he is the father of Glory. The child that haunts Max in Fury Road. Yeah, that's Dementus' kid. So the way it happened was that Dementus became the ruler of Gastown and he was given Hope as a wife. So he knocked her up, and that's how Glory came to the world. I mean, it's not official or anything. I just choose to believe that it is. And when you watch the film, Furiosa asked Dementus about a woman from 15 years before, and the first one that came to his mind was a redhead.
Do you remember her?
Redhead. Even a pew.
So, I don't know, was he talking about Hope? I don't know, maybe I'm reaching, you tell me, I don't know. The game also features the Demented Chariot, which it's not a chariot, it's a motorbike on a car. And it's in a cave that's got the 40-day war from the movie painted on the wall, 9 years before the movie came out. I'm sure George was just thrilled.
It wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. It wasn't in our hands.
It also mentions that Scrotus defeated Dementus, which is true. It's in line with the movie. He was defeated by Rictus and Scrotus. It just doesn't say that Furiosa went after him. And that's about all about Dr. D or Dementus from the game. I mean, it may or may not be canonical, but it's worth mentioning. Now, let's take a look at how he evolved in the lead up to the film. Around 2019, the script for Furiosa reached a gargantuan 250 pages, but it still did not say who Dementus was. But that was about to change after George Miller met with Chris Hemsworth. So Chris, like any self-respecting Australian, is very familiar with Mad Max. His father, Craig, introduced him to it, and he was even involved in a roundabout way with the first Mad Max, because he was a biker himself and knew the motorcycle club that's in the film, the Vigilantes, but he's not in the movie. No, he only looked after their dog called the Wonder Dog. But later he got a cameo in Furiosa right there. But Chris, well, he wanted to play Max back in 2009.
I think I asked my manager years ago about Mad Max, and then Tom Hardy had already been cast.
Got it.
And so, yeah, but I'd always sort of wondered, I'd miss my window.
And he later admitted that it was probably way too early for him to tackle that role anyway, but after watching Fury Road, he wanted to meet with George Miller, and eventually he did, in Sydney, in 2019. Chris showed to have great understanding of philosophy, psychology, and personality disorders that make a villain not just dangerous, but intriguing, which would later inform Dementus' personality and backstory. So he was cast, and immediately they started working on the character. George Miller thought that Dementus was a version of historical leaders like Genghis Khan, so in early concept art, he looked primal, with animal fur, and he even still had that scar around his face and what looks like Slit's prototype gauntlet. Then Dementus became more sophisticated and changed his look as the story went along, which was not easy for the costume designers. They took inspiration from ancient Roman warriors, Michael Jackson, Gaddafi, Rajneesh and Rael, and created 3 different looks for Dementus. The White Dementus, the deceptively trustworthy Messiah. The Red Dementus, the power-hungry, depraved, and barbaric warlord at his peak. And the Dark Dementus, corrupted and consumed by power near his end. George added a parachute to the costume because, it's functional and it could show Dementus' changes with different colors. So Jenny Bevan sourced a parachute from Silverman's Limited, a London store specializing in military surplus equipment for movies and TV. And with concept artist Tom Botwood, they created first ink illustrations of White and Red Dementus. It had those crazy body chamber type constructs, but it was something that they could build on, and eventually, through trial and error, many costume fittings, and countless Zoom meetings, the final designs came to life. So the White Dementus would use the parachute like a Messiah's robe with the Intel LGA 775 heatsink made to look like a crucifix. The Red Dementus was modeled after the Roman warriors with his parachute cape dyed red. And the Dark Dementus would wear the Guardian of Gastown's Hussar jacket, inspired by Michael Jackson, and his cape became black from all the smoke and soot in Gastown. Now, Dementus' nose, well, it evolved as well.
One of the concepts, bit of art, he had a very aquiline nose, and I just really loved the look at it.
The nose was a few things. It was sort of Roman statue, picturesque and so on. But then we saw one of the stunt guys that had a broken nose and it had sort of a bridge. And I was like, oh, okay, well, we get that image. But also, it's a broken nose. Of course, the wasteland, Now,
according to Lucky Hume, who played Rizdal Pell and the Immortan, the nose prosthetic was modeled after his own nose, but they added a bump to make it look a little bit different. Now, Chris wanted the nose to be bigger and bigger until it just started to look like a hobbit, so George dialed it down, especially because, according to Simon Duggan, the cinematographer, the wide-angle lenses exaggerated facial features either way. Now, Chris wore contact lenses to look tweaked, false teeth, a wig, and a fake beard made of yak hair, and Luca Vanilla and his team had put a ton of work into hair, They even burned it with tongs to recreate the sun-damaged effect. The makeup took 3 to 4 hours every day, after which Chris channeled all the pent-up energy into Dementus. He was also ready to get really skinny for the role, but George was against it.
Because at one point I was like, do you want me to lose a ton of weight and strip right down? And George said, no, I think he's a powerful, big, impressive figure and needs to hold a lot of space. And so...
Then, of course, is Dementus's voice, which is a combination of horse race commentators, angry seagulls, and his grandpa. So it was a rather abrasive mixture and not specific to any time period. Now, Chris's transformation into Dementus was amazing, and even his friends didn't recognize him in the trailer. And George Miller became more familiar with Dementus than with Chris.
When I saw you, Chris, I didn't believe you were authentic. I thought you were an imposter. And it's a really strange thing to happen, that they are real, and when I meet the actors, they're not real to me. They're just people, they're imposters.
Okay, let's talk about Dementus's weapons. His weapons of choice are a compound bow and the modified single-action LeMat shotgun revolver. In reality, it was a non-firing die-cast replica made by Denix in Spain. You could tell by the lack of pivoting lever on the hammer, and the serial number 2054, which is on all of the replicas. Now, Jonathan Ferguson, he is a huge fan of Mad Max, and he has a whole video about the original LeMat that this replica was based on, so make sure you check that one out. Now, having said that, the way that Furiosa loads it in the film is just not how you do it. You have to shove down a charge and shot with a ramrod and then put a percussion cap in the back, and then you have to move the lever that pivots the hammer, which is not even on the replica. So what she does in the film is she front loads a shell made of brass and there's a magnet holding it in, and that whole thing was a last-minute addition to begin with. It also has this peg on the side, which is for the quick draw rig, and it would slide into a fabricated clip on his belt, but the metal replicas were just often sliding off, so the cable tied them to the belt, which is why Chris was mostly using lightweight rubber LeMats, except for, the close shots where he used the metal replicas. They had 4 non-firing Denix replicas because George Miller did not want any blanks to be fired on the set, so all the muzzle flashes in this film are CG. Okay, so let's take a look at his vehicles. Now, back in 2007, Dementus only had a motorbike, but they turned it up a notch or a few notches over the years. It's a custom bike made by JRL Cycles, and according to the information that they gave me, the model of the bike is Lucky 7, but the actual name of the bike is Blackjack. And it's the second out of 4 radial bikes built by JRL Cycles in the US with an Australian Rotec engine. So this one was built in 2007 and sold to a private collector in Alaska who probably sold it for the film, but it was damaged in shipping, and the film's production reached back to the original builders to replace the front, and that's how they found out which one was used in the film. According to concept artist Shane Baxley, it was supposed to be destroyed in the film and replaced with a Chariot, but they worked it into the Chariot instead. But most of all, Chris Hemsworth actually got to keep this one.
I convinced someone that I could take the bike that my character had from the film back home, and it's in the bar downstairs. They told me to promise I wouldn't start it up. I said, "Have you met my kids before?"
The idea for the motorbike Chariot came from Colin Gibson, who showed George Miller a newsreel from the 1930s with the local police putting on a motorbike show in Sydney. The race in the footage was based on Ben-Hur, a movie that George Miller loves, so he figured, okay, this is exactly what Dementus would ride. Originally, it had 2 motorbikes, and some designs used car bodies, and one even had a detachable shield. But they settled on a fairly conservative design that seems to be loosely based on the Greek-style Chariot with blades from Ben-Hur. It was connected to a couple of 2021 BMW R18s on the sides, and the Radial Bike was in the middle, and all of them were decorated with human hair made to look like horses' manes and tails. Now, despite what Colin Gibson says in the behind the scenes...
So we have braking, throttle, etc. as footpad controls, so he's really just steering and holding on for dear life.
Yeah, those were dummy controls, they did not work. In reality, it was driven by a stunt driver hidden right behind the bikes. All 3 bikes were fixed in place. And according to Chris Hemsworth, the bike Chariot was uncomfortable, loud, and not very practical, but it definitely looked awesome. So the 6-foot was supposed to be cobbled together from lesser vehicles that Dementus acquired over the years. Originally, he was going to find an old 1939 Plymouth tow truck and gradually just turn it into the 6-foot, while keeping Furiosa caged behind the grill, which, I mean, it's an insane idea, but they removed it because it wouldn't exactly track with the story. So instead, the 6-foot in the movie was made from the tow body of the 1948 tow truck called Jail Bar, and the cabin in the front came from the Mack war rig that he attacked, and the audio equipment came from the karaoke cage, and yes, that's what that thing is really called. And it has a powerboat chair in the back, and it's flanked by two 35mm film canisters, which are Easter eggs, by the way. George Miller put one in Elvis too. Now, the Mack Bulldog ornament, it has 3 heads, which is a reference to the 3-headed hound of Hades called Cerberus. In mythology, it protects the gates of the underworld, and in the film, it protects Gastown. The truck also cages 3 dogs in the back, just to drive that point home. And it has this huge excavator stick rake that was repurposed to protect the front. It was supposed to pivot, and we would see it just before smashing through the gate of the bullet farm, but they never filmed that. In real life, the whole thing was based on a monster truck called Samson, built in 1999 in Victoria, Australia. The truck has a chain drive powered by a 454 supercharged Chevy Big Block V8 with the Power Glide automatic transmission, but it did not power the third axle. That was just a lazy axle, doing nothing pretty much. The whole thing sits at 4.4 meters tall with the boom arms in resting position, and Chris Hemsworth said that he felt incredibly small propped up on top of it, and he also wanted to have it, just like the Radial Bike, but they wouldn't let him. Right, so let's talk about his personality. When Chris came into the picture, this whole idea of Dementus from the anime being this emotionally unavailable, brooding guy, well, that whole thing went into the bin. And what was left on the pages was Dementus that was just a villain and nothing else, so they had to work with that.
The interesting thing about this character initially that struck me was there was this villainous persona. It was very important for George and I to find the humanity in the character.
It took him 2 years to find his humanity in Dementus, and it wasn't easy. He had a lot of ideas that were often so contradictory that...
At one point, we decided to sort of lean into the absurdity of the character.
And Colin Gibson, production designer, he loved this absurdity. He even wanted Dementus to be like the Joker from the 1989 Batman.
The way that Colin wanted Dementus to be was like the Joker from 89 Batman, right? Like having fun with it all the time, Now, George and Chris took it in a different direction, but this is what Colin wanted to have, right?
Yeah, but that wasn't it. So for 2 years, they were still trying to figure out who Dementus was. And at a certain point, Chris just started to panic.
In the build-up, and I'm talking a couple of years, I was scared out of my mind. I'm like, I'm going to derail, one of the most iconic franchises. I'm going to bring down Mad Max.
So a couple of weeks before filming, Chris went to George for some advice, and George suggested that he should read a book, How to Be a Dictator by Frank Dickiter. And he also suggested something quite unusual.
George suggested I write as Dementus, some sort of diary entries, and so just as an acting exercise, do it. And I said, oh, yeah, maybe.
Chris woke up in the middle of the night and wrote in a journal. My memory was about 4 or 5 pages. I remember there were about 3 words crossed out in the middle of it. And when I read that, I thought, holy cow, he really does. He's dug down way deeper. Much more than I had in many ways, particularly from the point of view of his character.
Chris focused on the teddy bear that was just a piece of a costume, and he realized that Dementus's behavior comes from his broken childhood, and the teddy bear is a symbol of that.
I believe that immaturity and that childlike sort of wildness comes from an abusive background.
And that whole idea did not fall out of the sky because Chris's parents are pioneering child therapists, and Chris himself was very interested in the whole issue of what happens to children.
Child abuse is a really tough topic, but if we want to do something about it, it's one we have to face.
And just like that, just 2 weeks before filming, Dementus's behavior started making sense. So they wrote a whole new backstory for Dementus, where he came from this wealthy family that escaped the chaos to a remote island, and that's where he grew up. But his own father was extremely violent towards him, and that completely broke him. And then he became a father himself, but he did something so horrific that he was banished from the island. He was forced back onto the mainland. So just from this backstory alone, we can now understand why Dementus behaves the way he does. He grew up in privilege and isolation in a world that was set on fire. And that made him a raging narcissist. That's why he has affinity for wealth and splendor, because he lived that life.
Rule with me in the splendor of a new wasteland!
That's why he's so convincing when he talks about it, and people just kind of follow along. Now, just like any narcissist, his ego is extremely fragile, and it's so inflated that he fashions himself after historical leaders despite being completely ignorant about history. I mean, he really is a moron. You know, he just takes words from the history man and uses them all wrong just to appear smart.
Sorrow is more piquant, zesty.
Now, another trait of his narcissism is manipulation, and he does it all the freaking time. He uses people and just throws them under the bus, and when something goes wrong, it's never his responsibility, it was never his fault.
Everyone's saying it's my fault, or it's everyone's fault.
But this narcissism is just one side to his personality, because what he went through as a child literally stopped his brain from developing properly.
Abuse, you know, when as a young child, you know, parts of the brain don't develop properly, and you see this character, you know, he's, I don't know, 40-year-old man at some point, but behaving kind of like a child, throwing tantrums.
And unfortunately, that is a real thing that happens to children that go through those experiences. You know, they end up having problems with emotional regulation, impulse control. They develop some unhealthy coping mechanisms and many other things that lead to severe problems in adult life. And Dementus has all those issues on full display. He has stunted emotional growth, which is why he uses this guy to help him express his own emotions.
I'm here just to help Dementus feel how he's feeling, fill in the gaps of his emotions.
He's also stubborn like a child, so he's capable of getting what he wants, but once he has it, he has no idea what to do with it, which is why he ran gas down into the ground. He had just no plan for that place at all. And he would do the same thing with the bullet farm and the Citadel if he had a chance. So the real question is, why does he do this? Why does he need more and more? Well, he does it to feel something. It's to wash away the cranky black sorrow of his own broken childhood and the family that he lost. And he gets to feel something through not just conquering, but through inflicting violence, even on himself. That's how he built up his pain tolerance to an insane degree.
And I've got a fiendishly high pain threshold. Again! Do it again!
And emotionally, it burned him out completely. And it dawned on him when he was tormenting Jack and Furiosa for hours, and it just didn't do anything for him anymore.
I said to George, I think he's like, on some level, is realizing that this isn't fulfilling this, which I thought was quite tragic for the character at that point.
So how does Furiosa fit into all this? Well, Dementus thought of her as his own child, so he wanted to raise her the same way that he was raised, by using violence to toughen her up and denying her any love, which makes you think what kind of a father he was to his own kids. Maybe he did something to them, and maybe that's why he was kicked off the island. Or maybe he did something to his own father, who knows? So when he sees Jack and Furiosa embrace each other, he goes ballistic, because he sees an emotion that he was denied.
You break my heart, and that's not fair.
That's an emotion that his father told him to bury deep inside and never show at all, because in that world, you cannot be soft.
We cannot be soft!
That dialogue, I felt like, was almost something he was repeating that had been yelled to him once upon a time. Something that an abusive father might stamp upon their son.
So he made an example out of them, and he took it all away from Furiosa for the second time, which is why she decided to turn his existence into unspeakable horror. Okay, so now that we know Dementus' backstory and his personality, it will make it so much easier to understand the ending of this film. Originally in the script, this was chapter number 9, called Discourse of Vengeance, because it was supposed to be all talk between Furiosa and Dementus, but as the movie went into production, they changed it to chapter number 5, called Beyond Vengeance. Also, Anya Taylor-Joy, she requested that Furiosa beats the living hell out of Dementus just to get some kind of revenge, and she got it.
What do you feel it should have?
I need to beat the living shit out of him.
But that was not supposed to be Dementus' punishment. Instead, his true punishment is that he will never get what he wants. So why this punishment? Well, that's because George Miller and his dramaturg Nicola Thuris, they're really big on mythology, and they wanted to repackage a classic Greek myth about Tantalus. It's about a man who was punished for his hubris by being eternally stuck in the underworld, surrounded by water that he could not drink and fruit that he could not reach. And that's where the word tantalize comes from. And this will be Dementus' fate almost down to a T. For everything and everyone that he tore apart just to feel something and forget about his own traumatic childhood and the family that he lost. Now, Furiosa was in his path of destruction and she lost everything, twice. So she will now deliver the punishment while trying to stay true to her principles. So, let's break it down. It starts with Dementus holding a flask, but there's no water in it. His bike is there, but there's no front wheel. He still has his gun, but there's no bullets. He can run, but he'll never escape. And Furiosa even lets him take the knife, but it's broken. You see where this is going? He's already being teased with things within his reach, but he can't have them. She then teases him with water, but it's not for him to drink. Instead, it foreshadows his fate. And despite being chained, he still commits the sin of wanting something, a quick and painless send-off. And she denies it too. She then starts swinging at him, the fury just gets the best of her, but in his pursuit of sensation, he lost the ability to feel pain, so those blows, they don't mean anything. And he doesn't fear the afterlife either, so Furiosa will have to find a different way to get her revenge without succumbing to purely barbaric methods.
That cold, avenging angel. That wasn't him. That is not even the character.
So she will hurt him in a different way. She takes the only thing that he holds dear, the teddy bear. Then Dementus recognizes her, thinking his plan worked, that he turned her into a monster the same way his father made a monster out of him. But he's wrong. Furiosa was raised with love, not hate, so she'll never be him.
I am nothing like you.
You are me.
He wants her to make his suffering epic. And again, she'll only give him a taste of that. His suffering will be epically remembered, but not how he wants, not on his terms. Because no one will really know what happened to him. They will invent stories about his demise, from Furiosa shooting him through the teddy bear, something that was actually in the anime version a symbolic way of ending his past and present, through dragging him across the desert just like what he did to Jack, to crucifying him in the same way and on the same tree that Mary Jabasa was. That is until the history man steps up with the alleged true version of events. There he is, in the same place we saw Furiosa and Jack earlier. Dementus shares the fate of Tantalus almost down to a T. In a puddle of water he cannot drink, and fruit just out of reach that hangs from a tree that grew out of his body. The ultimate punishment for someone who got everything he wanted his entire life and destroyed so much in the process. Now the most basic things he wants will forever be beyond his reach. And yet he smiles at Furiosa, probably thinking that Furiosa became corrupted, but she grew positivity from his negativity in the form of the peach tree. The peach fruit she picks is a symbol of happiness, longevity, and peace. But she can't have it. She's too far gone in her ways to deserve it, so she brings it to the wives, cut into 5 pieces, one for each. They're uncorrupted enough to deserve it. And for them, it's also evidence of a better place that they only know from books. It encouraged them to escape and ultimately end the Immortans' empire, so in a way, Dementus indirectly changed the course of history. Now, his fate that I just described was never meant to be taken literally, it was purely fantastical and allegorical. So the final question is, what really happened to Dementus? I think that she did end his life, and then brought his body to the Citadel and used it as fertilizer for the peach tree, because they use human bodies to grow crops.
All elements of the human body are reprocessed and recycled. Bodies will be used for mulch, for fertilizer.
But since it was hidden away in Furiosa's secret place, a legend was born. A legend so powerful that turned her into a living deity that you don't want to mess with. And that gave her incredible authority that allowed her to take the wives from the Immortan, but that's a story for a whole different video. So what is the moral of this whole thing? Well, it's that we have a choice about how our past shapes our lives. We can either dwell on it and let it consume us, or we can use it for something positive. And I think we know which one of them chose the right path. And that is all about Dementus, although I'm sure I haven't touched upon everything because it would probably make this video even longer, but there's enough information to consider him the most complex Mad Max villain to date. And I really hope that it gives you a new perspective on that film next time you sit down and watch it. Now, I'd like to thank everyone who helped me in making this one. You know who you are. Now, this one took ages to make, so make sure you like and subscribe and all that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay shiny and chrome.